Hello and welcome to another video on my venture into the Shopsmith universe. If you aren't already aware, I recently bought 3 different Shopsmiths of different generations and models, and each one of them is in a very different condition. One is pretty much good to go. This one here works but needs some TLC, and then I have a third one that just doesn't really turn on and want to move at all. So what I'd like to do is get them all in working order. And it would probably make the most sense to start with the one that's pretty much already working, but it works and I don't want to touch it. So I'm leaving my Mark V that's in good condition alone for now, and I'm going to start with this old Mark VII. I guess this one was only made for a couple of years in around the 1960s, and what's special about it is that it can actually go in forward and reverse, which lets you basically tilt it in 2 different directions and do some different things that the Mark V couldn't really do. The biggest things that are going on with this is that, one, this part that should be able to go in and out for doing like the drill press operations and horizontal boring and all that different kind of stuff, it doesn't move. Not sure why. If I really force it, it goes a little bit. So I don't know if it's just something that there's one like set screw stuck or what, but I need to address that. And the only real maintenance that you should have to do on these things is every once in a while you take this cover off, which is just a couple of screws, and you're supposed to be able to get in here and put some oil on a little hole in here and a little oil on a back plate in here, inside of there on a little hole. However, it appears that old versions of the Shopsmith didn't come with this little hole to get oil in between 2 surfaces that need to be able to be lubricated. So I don't know how they were lubricated back when they first came out. Maybe they just weren't, or you had to take the whole darn thing apart to lubricate it every once in a while. But you can simply add that hole to these and drill it in, and then you have it. Because when I went to go oil this to try and get it back to working order, it didn't have a place to put it. Although this does turn on and I can bring the speed up and down, and it goes in reverse and it seems to function, it doesn't sound that good, and it seems to struggle trying to go between the different speeds. So what I'm going to do is just completely tear this thing down and clean it all up and put it back together and identify any things that might be broken in here that I wasn't aware of when I purchased this originally. And the beauty of these Shopsmiths, especially the older models, is the whole thing is just mechanical. There's really nothing special about it, and as long as you have the smallest amount of mechanical ability, you should be able to tear this thing down completely if you want to and put it all back together all by yourself with no special tools. So that's what I'm going to do in this video. Might have been wrong about reverse. Doesn't want to go in reverse now. It did go in reverse, but now it doesn't, so definitely needs some TLC.
To service the headstock, you need to remove the end cap, which is held in place with a set screw in each of the 4 tubes. Because my unit is a little rusty, I needed to persuade the end cap off. Then you can work the headstock off the track and pull it off of the guide tubes.
One of the things I'll have to address is this broken rail here. It might be salvageable, though I'm seeing broken teeth, so I might need to source some new ones. I might be able to reattach that here, and maybe it won't matter so much being down at the end, but might need to find a new rail somehow for this.
One of the features of the Mark VII was that it had a built-in dust collection system that ran off of an impeller that was at one point attached here. It apparently was notorious for robbing power and was often removed, like mine was. I just need to take off this piece of housing that I won't reinstall later to complete that deletion. As I take this headstock apart, I'm purposely not jumping to the internet to find tutorials so I can demonstrate that it's really straightforward as to how this thing comes apart. I am, however, utilizing some part diagrams so I know what all needs to come apart and what is where. I'll run into a few times where I do concede to looking stuff up, but it's mostly to confirm that I have the right idea and just need to be a little bit more persuasive. There is likely a more efficient order of operations to remove parts, but this made sense to me, and considering I had a few things stuck or broken, I may have needed to go slightly out of order to get things apart anyways. I'll start by separating the lower and upper halves of the headstock, and removing this faceplate from the case, another part that doesn't need to go back on. There are several screws around the interface of the top and bottom shell to remove, and once they're out, the bottom half with the motor attached comes right out, and I carefully work it off the belt and set this section aside. Ideally, you'd remove the belt first, but because my sheaves are so gummed up, I couldn't really get the belts to loosen up to remove them. The next assembly I'll be removing is the speed controller. To start, you pry off the Shopsmith logo. It's pretty tricky to get out, and it looks like mine got cracked previously taking it off, and I didn't do it any favors either. It's held in by this 3-prong spring thing. Next, you remove the snap ring. For some reason, I thought it was too small for my snap ring pliers, so I took this off with a screwdriver, which I don't advise. Then, the speed dial can come right off. I decided to mark mine so I can remember how to put it back on. It could be placed on 180 degrees the wrong way if you're not paying attention. I then marked the positions of the little plate in the middle and the 3 screw positions because these pieces are adjustable, and then I removed them. Turns out I could have pulled the shaft out the back beforehand, but it didn't seem like it wanted to come out. But now it did. Next, I decided to take out the idler shaft assembly. The first thing you do is loosen the socket head cap screw so that the eccentric bushing is free to spin. There is also a screw and washer that gets removed that retains the eccentric bushing. I think ideally you'd then turn the eccentric bushing to release as much tension from the belt as you can, but I didn't do that and started tapping this part out. It bound up on the upper belt a little bit, so I started to remove some other parts to see if I could undo this. I took this sheave off and notice how hard it is to remove. This should just slide off because it's supposed to be nicely lubricated, which mine is not. Taking this off now didn't really help me, so I decided to be a little bit more persuasive and was able to get this assembly off the back. I removed the socket head cap screw completely then. With the idler shaft assembly out of the headstock, I could remove the sheave and this little key, which I thought was broken, but actually is supposed to have this little bend in it. Inspecting the bearing shaft and bearing assembly, I noticed it was quite wobbly and suspected something was broken, so it's time to start to take it apart and find out. To take this eccentric bushing off, you need to bend back the tabs on this fancy little retention washer that locks the nut in place. I'm pretty sure all of mine cracked doing this, as they only have a limited lifespan. Then you remove the nut. Note that the threads are left-hand threads, which are backwards from regular right-hand threads. With the nut off, you can remove the special washer. Then you remove a snap ring, which allows the eccentric bushing with the 2 bearings to come off. I took this second snap ring off as well then. Inspecting the idler shaft, you'll see that this whole section, which should be the same diameter, is not. At some point a bearing probably went bad and totally destroyed the shaft. Unfortunately for me, this part is unique to the Mark VII, and there's no replacement that I could find. So repairing or getting this shaft remade will be interesting. It's very similar to the Mark V, so there is a small chance I can get away with replacing it with a Mark V idler shaft, but that's for another video to figure out. Now I'm going to take out the rack advance and Quill.
Just won't move.
My rack advance is all messed up, so this process will be harder than it should be. If you pay close attention, you'll see that things are out of order, but this is how you typically would do it. To remove the rack advance, you take off the handle, then the locking knob, the depth gauge, and then these fancy spacers. The spacers may differ, so note how they come off on your unit. Then I took the locking knob off the other side along with the spring washer that was behind it. To get the whole rack advance shaft assembly out, you take off this snap ring and then remove the set screw that holds the spring housing in position. I marked how mine was clocked, but I don't know if that'll matter since it's all messed up. In a perfect world, this shaft would pull right out at this point, but much persuasion was required since mine was in rough condition. It finally did come out then. After I got this assembly out, inspecting inside the spring housing shows that the spring decided to go back the other way at some point, and it wasn't hooked into anything. I tried fixing it, but it was basically a waste of time. For $33, I can buy a whole new spring and housing ready to go right from Shopsmith. As far as I can tell, this was the cause of the bound up rack advance. Going back in time slightly, to remove the quill, you need to remove the set screw on the top. If your quill was never removed, there's probably some putty in the hole you need to pick out. Then, with great effort, not really, mine is just broken, you turn the rack advance all the way out until the quill can just slide out.
Okay, well, that part's out.
At this point, you need to carefully let the lever loosen up, but again, mine is broken so it doesn't do anything. Now I'll take out the drive sleeve assembly. To start, you need to remove this waved retaining ring. It's sort of unusual for the kind of retaining rings I've worked with, but I really like it in terms of how easy it is to remove. Now you need to push the drive sleeve out this side, but you need to hit it from the inside of the housing. What I did was find a long metal rod that I had lying around and put it inside this hole and then hammered on it. It didn't take much force to push the first bearing out. The second bearing was a little trickier because it didn't start straight, so it got bound up. I tapped on the edge of the bearing to line it back up, and then it came out easily. Spinning these bearings, it seems like the one on the right could be replaced. I'll likely replace all the bearings since I'm taking this thing apart anyways. Next, I'm going to take out this little lever assembly. It's used to lock the headstock to the table so you can slide them together. It's a neat feature of the Mark VII that the Mark V's never incorporated. It's basically just this little spring and then a nut and a bolt. Once that's removed, everything else is then free to come out. The last assembly that needs to come out is this headstock traverse assembly. This is a unique feature of the Mark VII that allows you to use a handle that rotates to move the headstock left and right on the way tubes. The first thing I did was remove this nut on the side and then remove the worm gear bracket held in by 2 bolts. My camera wisely decided to focus on the closest thing to it, so sorry this shot is pretty worthless. Now that the bracket is off, which was located here, I can remove the worm gear shaft assembly. You start by removing the snap ring. Use snap ring pliers if you have them. That frees this washer, spring, and clutch plate to come out. Then remove another snap ring, and you can remove the worm and spur gear. There is another snap ring that can come off of the shaft, but it's a stop for how far the shaft goes into the housing, so I ended up not removing it, and then pulled the shaft out of the housing. Now we can work on the traverse lock shaft assembly. Since I took the nut off the end of the shaft already, I started sliding components off. I didn't think about the spring getting loaded while everything to the left of it was sliding out, and the wedge lock, spring, and a washer went for a little flying adventure.
Oh,
Good thing I'm using the parts diagram, so I knew how many pieces I had to go looking for. Then I took off this spacer tube, another worm gear, and a small key, at which point I could pull out the shaft. There's two more components here that I didn't film removing, but it's another wedge lock and a little spacer here on the side. I spent some time trying to remove this plate here, but the screws didn't seem to want to budge and I didn't really have a need to remove it, so I left it be. At this point, the upper section is completely torn down, so I can set it aside and finish up with the bottom. There's not a whole lot to do with the bottom portion, but the first thing I'll do is remove the switch. It's held in place by two bolts with nuts inside of the housing. Once these are removed, the switch is free. I then carefully marked all the wires and took some pictures so I knew how it plugged back together. This switch is all messed up and I'll make a video dedicated to rehabbing it because it's quite an interesting design. Next, I loosened up the grounding screw for the motor. Then I took out the screws mounting the motor to the housing. There are 4 of them. After that, I used a pair of adjustable pliers to compress the retention clip for the power cord and took that off of the housing. The lower housing is now empty and I set it to the side. The last part to come apart here is the sheaves for the motor. There is a spring being held back by a snap ring that you need to remove. To do this, you need to have something like a board with a hole in it that will allow you to compress the spring and get to the snap ring. I actually had this board lying around from another project and it worked perfectly. Add some sort of clamps to compress everything, and then the snap ring is accessible. With the snap ring removed, I carefully removed the clamps.
okay, my setup's not perfect.
There is a cap and then the spring that comes off. After that, you can pull off the sheave. Notice how hard mine comes off. It should be easy. This again is why I need to add lubrication holes to this. To remove the inner sheave, you need to loosen a set screw. Then the sheave should slide out, but again, this one fights me. There's also a key and a little spacer behind that then. As far as I'm aware, the spacer is supposed to make contact between the motor and the inner sheave, but mine is sort of just chilling in there doing nothing. I'll have to figure out if the sheave should go further down the shaft or the spacer should be longer, but again, that's for another video to figure out.
So that's it. It really wasn't that hard to tear down this Mark VII headstock. In the process of doing so, I have identified a few things that do need fixing. I found that there is some sort of issue between the motor output shaft, this spacer, and the sheave. I need to work on this switch. Some of the insulation on the motor wires is frayed, so I need to address that. I need to replace a few bearings, and likely I'll just replace all of them as long as I can source them. Somehow fix or replace this idler shaft, and buy a new spring housing. The belts also look like they got a little frayed as well, so I may replace them also. I'll have links down in the description to the videos I make as I continue to rehab this unit. If you don't want to miss out on the rehabs of my Shopsmiths, which I do have 2 more of, please subscribe to my channel. If you found this video useful or interesting, please give it a like. And if you have any questions, comments, or requests for things to cover, that's what the comment section is for. I hope you enjoyed the video, and as always, have a good one.